Okay. Now, making these videos, and they're not, that ambitious. They're meant to be really basic introductions for, undergraduate humanities classes for the most part. So I'm not the Wizard of Oz. I'm not trying to do anything special. And so, and people watch them, the students, enough people tell me that it helps them get along through our distance learning to have these videos that, I'm glad. And it is also, as I've mentioned before, nice for me to document my own thinking about things, I guess. But, today I want to talk about William Shakespeare. And at that point, I have to, sort of ask myself, does the cosmos really need, a video from me about William Shakespeare? No, and then, I think about it, and the answer, I think actually the right answer to that is that there's plenty of stuff in William Shakespeare that we can always have an interesting time of it and find some stuff that's interesting to think about. And I do want then today to get to what I think is core stuff about William Shakespeare for me. What do I have to say about William Shakespeare? And it is stuff that I've been thinking about for a long time. It's been nice to make this video and have it crystallize for me. But what I'm not going to do is go over, all of his biography and that kind of stuff. I'll say one thing, which is that in the 1590s, in the early mid 1590s, Shakespeare starts to write these plays. They're comedy plays at first with lots of slapstick and farce in them. And then he starts also influenced by Christopher Marlowe, another great Elizabethan playwright. Shakespeare starts to develop histories and write these histories, which are sort of interesting because they're both about the current political situation and the historical situations that he's talking about. And then in the early 1600s, the 1600s, going into the 16 teens, we get the tragedies, which critics tend to say the tragedies are the best. And the tragedies do fit in very much with my sort of theory of Shakespeare, if you will, I want to give today, because what I want to say is that Shakespeare not only discusses things like greed or jealousy, obsession, that sort of thing, but in a sense, because of its historical place, and also because of some things I think that were actually kind of unique to William Shakespeare, the creator. I think he really sort of defines a lot of concepts, which is a very different thing from just being a sort of master of the language who talks about the concept. So let me get to that. Let me get on to this. Right. Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. Shakespeare, and I call it the be all and end all because I did that video on Cervantes, and he's very much at the beginning of sort of the novelistic tradition, undeniably. Shakespeare has an equal stature in the English language. But the thing is, Shakespeare sort of he's so important and so accomplished that it's kind of hard to see, that he's really been eclipsed by anyone since then. So he's the be all and end all in that sense, that slang sense, that he's the greatest. He's the end all. Maybe he's so good that we can't go on past him. The be all, the being of everything, that's like an existential pun, and we're going to get into these. Like I say, I think his ideas are essentially, when I say existential, there's the question of your essence and the fact that you exist. And it's, of course, the cliche from Hamlet, and right to be or not to be. But I think that along that kind of line, along thinking about what it is to exist, and in particular, this distinction between fiction and reality, supposedly. This is the same slide that's the second slide in my Cervantes video. That is, notice about a thing, the thing about Shakespeare and Cervantes, they overlap almost identically chronologically. Die, in fact, 10 days apart in the spring of 1616. They both are productive in the 1590s and 1600s mostly, ending by, of course, obviously their deaths in 1616. Um, and as students of literary history, one to point that out is if you can just remember that Cervantes and Shakespeare lived at the same time and are writing at the same time, then it makes it easier to put other things together and remember things about the one because you know things about the other. They are at the beginning of the Baroque, at the beginning of the 17th century, 1600s, a time of great, great change coming into the scientific revolution, which is in the background of them both. Remember with Cervantes, there's that on-running commentary about the new technology, not only the windmills. And Shakespeare has the same kind. Shakespeare, for example, is very interested in the exploration, in the news of the world that's coming from the explorers, from the Spanish and Portuguese and others. All right, so again, a note, they sort of go together, and I'm doing the two videos and putting them out this week together. The First Folio from 1623, 7 years after his death, Shakespeare actually made no provision. Some of his plays had been published, and some of them had not. Some of them had been published in small collections. But some of the most important plays, some of the plays that are considered among his greats, say he had made no provision for their publication at all. It was some of his friends who got together, again, these some years after his death in 1623, and put together this First Folio. The other thing that's important about this, so I think it's interesting that Shakespeare actually sort of wasn't really necessarily even going to bother. And the other thing about this is that engraving on the front of it is really one of the only likenesses of Shakespeare that's at all authenticated. He did sit for that one. There's only one or two of them actually, and then you get a sort of stereotypical or iconic Shakespeare who you see reproduced all over the place. Interestingly, looking things over here too, I also saw a painting of Christopher Marlowe with an earring in his ear that looked very, very much like another picture that I had seen identified as a picture of Shakespeare. So I thought that was interesting. So anyway, here's our theme, famous quotation from As You Like It that I'm sure you've heard before. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. And one man in his life plays many parts, in his time plays many parts. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. And we can take that as a sort of existential claim, that is, he is talking about the real world and the real men and women, and he's saying about them that it's a stage and that they're players. Then, there's a lot of levels we can take that. There's some easy levels we can take that. People act. This is something that the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, likes to talk about. The waiter is acting like a waiter. The working man, he's acting like a working man. As Simone de Beauvoir later developed and said, the woman, she's acting like a woman, the part that's been given. And in that sense, the world's a stage. We have a public persona that we present to the world. And of course, we compose and edit the persona that we present to the world. And, we have no choice but to do that. It's not as if that's in itself something wrong, but we do. But then we also have an interior world where we tell ourselves who we are. And a key to all this is all of that, what we tell other people when we're talking to them and we're telling them about ourselves, answering their questions, but also what we tell ourselves in an ongoing way as we continue along, like Don Quixote on our sort of life's quest. What we tell ourselves is also put into words. I mentioned something else the other day about when we were talking about Cervantes, that a theory of mind, which is that When we tell each other our dreams, it seems to me that it may be that we're actually constructing those linguistic representations in the act of sort of telling the dream. We're trying to convey what the dream was like to us, and we think we're remembering the dream the way we might remember watching a movie, but I think that what we're really doing is creating a linguistic object, which is what we think of as our description of the dream. But the dream is something altogether different from that. So the question of being, as I say, kind of thinking about, gee, what is the philosophic Shakespeare that gets me going? And well, gosh, being, and that sounds, well, of course, being is corny, but it is. The playwright creates a character. The playwright creates a world, and the playwright does it out of words. So these characters are made out of words. These characters are the set of all the words that the playwright has put down, about this character. So this fictional world is made out of words. It's a linguistic object. Now, meanwhile, we have the experiencing self, the conscious self, the one that tastes the spaghetti sauce, the one that can feel your feet on the floor or in your socks or in your shoes right now. Think about how your feet feel in your shoes right now. That. And that's pre-linguistic. Like I'm suggesting, maybe the dream might be in some sense pre-linguistic, the real dream, maybe somehow. We have an experience that's an experience, but it's not the experience that we have that we describe in language. And it's not definable by words in the same way that the color blue isn't defined. The color words, the poetry teacher can't tell you how to explain to a colorblind person what blue looks like. Our personhood, the person that people would describe if someone asked you, know that person, tell us about them, is maybe another one of these linguistic objects. Something that's been kind of built up, something that's edited, something that gets revised, something that gets abridged. Again, it's sort of an existential idea. But with Shakespeare, the question that he's always playing with is the interface between what we think of as fiction and what we think of as reality. And, so the playwright is God and making the little characters like the marionettes do whatever the playwright wants them to do. So that's where that character's coming from. There's some artful purpose on the part of the playwright. But we tell ourselves stories about who and what we are, and we tell each other and the public and the world stories. We have characters that we work on. But if we're not this character, if we're not all these qualities that we would mention or list if someone asked us to talk about ourselves, if those are all somehow linguistic, as I'm saying, in this very broad sort of way, as opposed to sort of real, consciously real, then it looks like there's a kind of nothingness where you ought to see the composer. Who's the composer? And I think this has to do with Shakespeare. I was thinking this. I was thinking that, it's Elizabethan England, a really great period for England, very liberalized period, lots of stuff going on. Not least these incredible plays of the Elizabethan era, this incredible theater that they had. And it's also the century of the Reformation, with all kinds of stuff, conflict going on, and ideas flying all over the place. All this liberation of people being able to say all sorts of things that they couldn't say under the old religious regimes and so on. All of that's happening. And we're coming into the scientific revolution of the 17th century, which is something that Cervantes and Shakespeare both are sort of sensitive to. You see it coming. And so I was thinking that then it must be that a whole lot of English words were just being invented during this period, because I tend to think, as you know, if you've seen others of these videos, that I'm with Tolstoy. There's kind of these large historical forces that are kind of carrying characters along. Characters are kind of products, for the most part, of their point in space and time, of their historical context. You know, that's I'm with that way of thinking about history. But looking at it, guess what? I mean, I'm not. That's not exactly right, because the thing is, Shakespeare's Shakespeare. He's this force of nature. And you can talk about the words. I give you some numbers here on this slide about the words. You could also talk about the phrases, the cliches, figures of speech. And they're startlingly everyday. They're ones that you use all the time. Again, I was going to put a slide with a whole bunch of words on it, but looking around on the internet, there's all these really excellent websites about how many words Shakespeare coined, and famous phrases and so on, maxims from Shakespeare. So I'm really just not going to, I think that would be a waste of time. I'm just going to send you to Google for that, and you'll very quickly see some really impressive stuff. That's the thing. I mean, yeah, maybe, sure, maybe coming out of the Reformation, coming into the Baroque, was this really pregnant period where people are making up words. And so that might explain Shakespeare, maybe. But it doesn't explain him all the way. Shakespeare is the genius. And what is his talent? His talent is with language. And in particular, he coins words. I use that word coin rather than say invent words, because you coin a new word within a language. Often Shakespeare's using suffixes and prefixes that hadn't before been used on a word, or taking the root of a word and turning it into another part of language. He does things like that. You know, so it's not just, you can't just make up a nonsense word. Coinage is something that people can understand. If someone says, if you say something and someone says, hey, is that a word? Is that what you said is really a word? Is that in the dictionary? I think the right answer is, well, did you understand what I was saying? And if the answer is, yeah, I did understand what you were saying when you said that word, then I would say it's a word. But, you know, for most of us, you know, we don't make the words up. Shakespeare is so talented with language that, like a poet, he's sort of literally making up words to describe things. He's describing things. And in particular, he's describing people's personalities, their psychologies, their psychological motives, and their psychological and emotional reactions to things. So as to this concept of meaning, the meaning of meaning, if you will, and so you have this sort of classical passive sort of idea that the word is just kind of a label that is attached to something, that it is its referent. Its usage is defined and fixed, and not to be violated. And so what the job is of the user of the language is to select the right words, words that designate or mean, in that sense, what you're trying to say. But language is more dynamic than that. Language is constantly morphing and changing. That's why most attempts to socially engineer language fail, whether they're trying to keep a language out or revive a language. Usually doesn't work unless the people who are actually the speakers of the language are on board with the project. And usually they're not paying attention, because again, language is a living, natural thing. it's flowing along and fluxing and evolving beyond anyone's control. As to what a word means, the idea is that, well, what it is that you're getting done by saying the word is sort of what you might call the meaning of the word. You see, it's more of an active notion of meaning rather than that classical sort of passive idea of meaning. And I think with someone like Shakespeare, who has this really protean genius with language, such that in his onward course as a writer, he's constantly, in fact, shaping the language to his purposes in a way that can be understood, in fact, in a way that conveys depth. That he is the living proof, I would say, of the correctness of the dynamic picture of language versus that sort of static representational picture of language. And that in turn, if that's correct, if it's correct that with Shakespeare we have someone who made an extraordinarily large contribution to the language, then we also have someone who made an extraordinarily large contribution to our sort of conceptual resources. And in fact, to the concepts that we think about, literally, again, not just using the word, but making the concept. And then we see that many of his plays have to do with particular kinds of emotions. You know, the innocent love of Romeo and Juliet and the sort of dangerous eros of Antony and Cleopatra and sort of everything in between. He's a psychological genius. But what is he doing? I think to get at how he does it or what it is, I think it's really his use of words. I think it's really his use of language. For myself, I don't see a big difference between a word and a concept. You have a word that you can use, and if you want to talk about it as a concept, I guess what you want to talk about is some kind of categorization or description of a broader sense or use of the word. Some people worry about how concepts are represented in the mind. I'm not sure if that's a real problem. I think if we stick to this idea that what we're interested in is the way that a word is used, we can stay in more or less clarity. So I think what philosophers do is a lot of conceptual analysis. A lot of what they do is conceptual analysis. So asking, for example, if we're involved in epistemological or metaphysical unusual situations by a concept like mind. Does the concept of mind involve us in something that's non-physical, and then we have to deal with how we feel about non-physical things? Does our concept of justice involve us in what we think of as true, and now we have to deal with the general question of what makes a proposition true or false? So asking whether the concept is taking us, when do you call the plumber? You have a drainage problem, you call a philosopher, you want to sort of get clearer on, there's something odd about the metaphysical epistemology of a word. Shakespeare, though, is looking at, he's making up characters, but yeah, after all, he's looking at human beings, whether in real life or in his mind's eye or however. But he's a portraitist, he's an emotional portraitist. Capturing, Othello's jealous anger, or capturing the ambitions of Richard III, or he gives us these pictures, and so then the words that he's using, the descriptions that he's giving, are often involving sort of coinages and perspective of Shakespeare's own, and then these come down to us. Again, he makes a very, very large contribution to the language, to the word pool, if you will. So part of the way we see people and see their emotions, describe their emotions, is owing to Shakespeare, the expressive power of Shakespeare. And that means that the last bullet point on the slide there, if that's true, then in the same way that Shakespeare has created these characters, so too he has to some extent created us. And so then we get to this real moving across that boundary between the fictional and the real. Exactly the same thing we saw happening in Cervantes, and certainly not coincidentally. Something about the emergence of the individual in modern times is going on here, with this fascination about the authenticity of the individual. And we see this early on in the comedies, when he perhaps Shakespeare doesn't quite realize that he's Shakespeare, although he was always very well respected. It's farces, it's slapstick farces. Oftentimes a party of gentlemen and a party of ladies will encounter each other, or a party from a noble house will encounter some people from somewhere else. Maybe they'll be out in the woods someplace, or in a country house. And then there'll be farce. There'll be misinterpretations, mistaken identity. People will hatch silly plots. People will then eventually start telling each other stories and even dressing up and cross-dressing and other things in order to fool each other. And you get these farces, classic farces, like in the old movies where the people are running in and out of the doors and slamming the doors and being silly. And it was for popular entertainment. But when we look at them, there's some very common themes that run through these early comedies of Shakespeare. And one of them is this idea that people are always concealing themselves and presenting themselves as something else. They don't want you to see something about them, and they want to make you think something about them that isn't true. And something's going wrong with that. And then it turns out you didn't understand them. And then in a lot of these plays, I list some of them there. The Comedy of Errors very early. Comedy of Errors very early. That's like 1595. Love's Labor's Lost, Two Gentlemen of Verona, All's Well That Ends Well. And in all of these, in addition to all of those involved, by the way, people disguising themselves, people reading the wrong note and misinterpreting who wrote it, what it says, that sort of thing, all of them. And they all end with these, what have been called by other writers, unmasking scenes at the climax, where everyone realizes, everyone comes off it for some reason, the plots all fall apart. Usually the endings, these are popular comedies, the endings are usually fairly cheery, with the real lovers finally manage to figure it out and get together, and that kind of thing. So you have these fictional characters created by Shakespeare, and then they have fictional characters within the play, and they feel that when they don't have to be in character anymore, they're now liberated to pursue their own lives as fictional characters. But it's really in the tragedies. I am of the opinion, it's a popular opinion, many people have, that the tragedies that he writes after the turn of the century, the early 17th century, are really his greatest works. I'll look at Hamlet, King Lear, and Macbeth. Hamlet, again, he is the Prince of Denmark out at Elsinore, the castle, and he is suspicious because his mother has married his uncle not very long, just a short time after the rather mysterious death of his father. Now his mother and his uncle are sort of taking over the kingdom. Of course, Hamlet, the eldest son, only son of the dead king, was the rightful heir to the kingdom. So the question is sort of, well, what are you going to do? It's just in the air, though. No one's challenging him directly. And he's visited by a ghost. He's up in the ramparts one night, and the ghost comes. In fact, the ghost comes to him repeatedly and telling him that the ghost is unhappy because he was foully murdered and the kingdom has been usurped, and it's up to Hamlet. And a traveling band of players comes through and mounts a play within a play, very common trick of Shakespeare. And in that play, too, they reveal, even down to the poison being poured in the ear of the king. But here's a take on it. Here's a take on Hamlet. Um, Hamlet doesn't want to put things in words. He doesn't want to nail himself down because he has some sort of plan. No, not necessarily, because the thing is, the more you nail it down, the more you define it, the more you decide what it is, the more you declare what it is to yourself and to others, the more concrete it becomes, the more locked in it becomes. Are you going to think these things? If you think them long enough, they'll become real. If you say anything in language, the language is sort of creating this reality. And under that, there isn't anything. So, right, if there's this sort of pre-linguistic life that's not captured by language, if that's true at all, then this edifice of language, including the linguistic object or cultural object, which is our own conception of ourselves, our own reputation as persons, all of that is not what we are. And so in a sense, language leads to a kind of death, a death by reification, a death by turning into concrete, death by objectification. Language is objectifying things and locking them in, causing them to gel and to set. And so Hamlet, one time I messed up with a class one time. I forgot what I did, but I decided that it penance for the class that I would learn Hamlet's soliloquy and act it out, which I did. And I had this old dagger, this Scottish dagger, and I had it in the book bag. And when he said he could kill himself with a bear bodkin, and I pulled it out, and somebody in the back of the class screamed, and went, "Ah!" I thought I was going to kill myself right there in front of the class. So I counted that as a success. This is also from Hamlet's soliloquy. The undiscovered country, of course, he means by death. Who knows what, but in that sleep of death, what dreams may come. And so we're afraid of dying. In a sense, to describe yourself is to sort of get ready for death, right? We're talking about that relationship between language and death. But any undiscovered body, from whose bourne no traveler returns, you don't come back. And this puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. We're cowards. We don't want to go into the unknown. One way that we protect ourselves from that is to construct, right? To construct this identity. So Hamlet has to decide what he is. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought. Sicklied o'er the pasty white goth cast of thought. Too much irony, too much reflection, too much self-consciousness. Can't decide. The words are paralyzing. King Lear is really a lot like Don Quixote, I think, in a sense, only a much more tragic kind of picture. Of course, he divides. He exiles his one daughter who's trying to tell him the truth, and he divides his kingdom between the two daughters who are of worse personal character. And obviously, this is a terribly tragic decision on his part. But why does he do it? Because he believes in all these kingly virtues, and he thinks that the world is going to play along with all these kingly virtues about dignity and loyalty and honor and the house, the royal house, and all this stuff. He's sold on all that stuff, just like Don Quixote. And he also has to come to an end when he realizes that was not a mistake. But was it his own infirmity? He's going mad, or the wickedness of his daughters, is that what causes the tragedy? No, what causes the tragedy is that he can't see around these concepts that he has about what the world is like and deal with the real world. He doesn't want to think about the way the real world is. He doesn't want to think about how he doesn't get to decide which one of his children he'll tolerate in his presence, for example. He doesn't get to decide how kings and ex-kings get treated in this world, and so on. But he thought that he did, and why did he? Because he had a whole big picture, just like Don Quixote. And Macbeth, the witches curse Macbeth, and it's pretty clear that it's a curse. But all he hears is he's going to usurp these other people. They're not his enemies. King Duncan and his friends are not against Macbeth. It's only that Macbeth hears this prophecy that he's going to take over. And so he starts to put the prophecy to work because he likes the prophecy. He likes to hear that. He's being told what he wants to hear. Again, he forgets it's a curse. And Lady Macbeth is very ambitious too. After all, her whole picture of being married to Macbeth, being married to one of the lieges and so on, is that she's coming up in the world. She's gonna be somebody. And so she goes along with Macbeth. And they do terrible things. They send assassins, and they send assassins even, and their target isn't there, but the wife and children are killed, and so on. This leads to disaster, but they've also betrayed their friends, any political allies that they have. And Lady Macbeth starts to lose it. She doesn't really have it. We think Lady Macbeth is sort of Dragon Lady or something, but she doesn't have it. She doesn't have the belly for it. She starts to become unglued, and she starts to hallucinate. She starts to hallucinate daggers hanging in the air. She's hallucinating. She's seeing things that aren't there. She was seeing some other things that aren't there. Lady Macbeth's response to the disaster is to move on to even worse delusions of hallucinations and self-erasure. But that's not what happens to Macbeth. Macbeth, when he finds out about his wife's suicide and that the sons of the enemies now enemies that he has betrayed are moving on him and he is doomed, Macbeth's response is not to go into hallucination, delusion, like Lady Macbeth. Rather, Macbeth comes out into a kind of a clarity about the vanity of thinking that he was anything at all. The ego itself, after all, is a construction. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesteryears have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief Kendall. Ready to die. He's ready to die now. Life's but a walking shadow. A poor player. Life is but a walking shadow. A poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. A tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. A bleak assessment by this man who has been seduced into destroying his own world by his own deluded constructions, his own deluded projections, projecting out onto the world what you want to believe. And so it's all about this image and reality, but with Shakespeare, as with Cervantes, there's no privileging either side of the looking glass, which is a serious proposal. that William Shakespeare gives us. I thought it was very swift by ending with Cervantes' signature, the last one, but then I started to cough and I shot the whole video, so what did I do? Here's William Shakespeare's signature. It's kind of cool when you go farther away from it. Anyway, I do think that you should read both some Shakespeare, some Cervantes. Here's the thing: if you haven't read a lot of period literature, then if you're better in Spanish and your English isn't so good, try and read Cervantes in that early 17th century Spanish that he's writing in. And if your English is better than your Spanish, try and read some Shakespeare in his language. Some people will say, oh, I just can't read that at all. I can't make heads or tails of it. But actually, it's very good practice if you can make heads or tails of it. And notice this, that the more you have read in general, the more literate you are, the more familiar with reading and writing in general you are, the better and easier you're going to understand the language in its version from 500 years ago, 400 years ago, rather. So it's all about the language, I think, here. And so now we're going to go on into the Baroque and talk about a couple of things about that interesting century. We're going to do two or three topics for each century now. We're going to do, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, the next 4 centuries, and we'll do 2 or 3 topics for each one, which will do us. All right, I'll talk to you soon. And I'll see you on Friday at the Zoom meeting. I'll put up a bunch of links here. There's all kinds of really cool Shakespeare links. So I encourage you to look around for that. Okay, talk to you soon.